Hey guys, welcome back. This is Dave Forman here at One Line Coffee. Thank you for visiting our YouTube channel one more time. As you know, we have been working on a brew at home series where we focus on different individual brew methods. Today we decided to do something just a little bit different. Rather than teach you about brewing on one method, we thought it would be cool to actually teach you a little bit about all brew methods. We decided we wanted to teach you guys an extraction theory course. Now this is actually a condensed version of a class that we teach to our own wholesale accounts. We teach it internally too to our own baristas. The idea behind the course is to give you a good idea of how coffee works, how coffee extracts, and then think about how that applies to our brewing at home. So, welcome to extraction theory. First thing we're going to do is we're actually going to go through the 6 primary brew variables that we control anytime we brew coffee. We're going to go through 4 of them rather quickly. We're not going to go into too much detail. They're pretty easy to understand. It's going to bring us to our last 2, which are going to be the bulk of our conversation today. So let's get going. Brew variable number 1 is going to be water quality. We could spend a lot of time talking about water quality, but basically, you want water that tastes good, but also brews well. Most of us don't have access to an EPA lab report that can tell us what's in our water. If you know your water is good for brewing, correct hardness, correct alkalinity, you can certainly use it, usually running it through a refrigerator filter or a Brita filter of some sort can work all right. Certainly on Columbus City water that works pretty well, where we are. If you don't know what's in your water, a good option is to use something like third wave water. They create these mineral addition packets that you can add to distilled water. It'll give you the perfect ratio that you need for brewing. Number 2, we want to talk about water temperature, and this one is pretty easy to understand. Water is a solvent. It acts as a solvent when it extracts coffee. So the hotter the water, the better a solvent water is. Now, a lot of people will tell you if your water is too hot that you could burn your coffee. That's 100% false. It is very difficult to burn something that has been roasted to over 400 degrees. But what can you do if you use water that's too hot? Well, you can certainly over-extract your coffee, get a lot of bitter notes, a lot of roast notes, but especially if you aren't accounting for any other variables like grind size and some other things that we're going to talk about here in a bit. Most importantly, for water temperature, you just want to be consistent. I generally recommend doing 30 seconds off boil, 20 seconds off boil, just because that gives you enough time to get your kettle either off of the stovetop or off of your little electric pad, hit a tare button, hit a timer, and start brewing. So really just be consistent. Typically at home we're brewing with 208 to 210 water. Number 3, we're going to talk about agitation. So agitation is another pretty easy one to understand. Anytime we agitate a brew or agitate the grounds in a brew, we're going to increase extraction. The easiest kind of way that I can explain this, or the best visual I can give you, is tea brewing. Take some tea, throw it into a glass brewer, add some water, and watch it. You're going to see that extraction slowly happen. See those dissolved materials start to kind of float off that tea. If you stir it, all of a sudden you see this whoosh, all of this stuff comes off all at once. And that's because you're agitating the tea and you're increasing the level of extraction. Really what you're doing is you're just simply forcing more water to flow over the surface of those coffee grounds than otherwise would be happening. So we increase extraction. The 4th thing to talk about in terms of brew variables is going to be our extraction time. And again, this one's pretty easy to understand. The longer your exposure of grounds to water, the more stuff you're going to extract. So the longer the brew, the more extraction. Shorter the brew, less extraction. Again, a pretty easy concept to understand. That brings us to the 2 that are going to comprise the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. So number 1 is going to be our dosing, or our coffee to water ratio. Our second one is going to be our grind size. I want to give you a brief overview of both of these, just so that we have a good understanding before we start to talk about 2 numbers that are very important to quantifying our brews. So, dosing is pretty simple. It's a ratio. How much water am I using per gram of coffee? For something like batch brew, we're typically going to be around a 17-to-1 ratio. For something like manual brew, we might be a little bit stronger, maybe something like 14 to 1 or 15 to 1. For espresso, even though we measure it slightly differently, 2 to 1 seems to be a pretty acceptable ratio. It's about what we're at within our own stores. So that's a pretty easy concept to understand. The second one is grind size, and here is where it gets really interesting. And this is where the bulk of our conversation today is going to come from. So, grind size, why is it important? Well, the first thing to understand is that when we actually brew coffee, we aren't necessarily pulling stuff out from inside of the individual coffee grounds. What we're really doing is we're washing extractable material off of the surface of those grounds. Now that's a really good thing. Because of that, we actually have really good control over the amount of extractable material that we actually make available to water. So think about it this way. Say I have a coffee bean, like this. I break it in half. What am I doing? I'm exposing this interior cut to water. If I take each one of those halves and I break them in half, what am I doing? I'm exposing surface area. And it turns out that the finer and finer and finer I grind, the more surface area I'm actually exposing to water during an extraction. Therefore, the higher the level of extraction is going to be. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So now that we understand dosing and we understand grind size, let's talk a little bit about the two numbers that are really important to us. So those are TDS and extraction yield. So TDS stands for total dissolved solids. So essentially, that's simply a measure of the strength of a solution. And for coffee, it's a measure of how much of a solution of coffee is actually extracted material. Now, we express TDS in the terms of a percentage. So for instance, let's say I have 100 grams of brewed coffee sitting in a cup in front of me. If it's drip coffee, let's say it's at 1.35% TDS. What that means is that in that cup of coffee, I have 1.35 grams of extracted coffee material and 98.65 grams of water. We could go to something like espresso and do the same thing. Espresso, at least in our shop, has a TDS around 9.25%. So if I had 100 grams of liquid espresso, which is a few shots, I would literally have 9.25 grams of extracted material and about 90.75 grams of water. So the interesting thing about TDS, especially when we're talking about brewed coffee, is that there's a lot of subjectivity there. It turns out some people really do like coffee that's a little bit weaker. Some people really do like coffee that's a little bit stronger. And here there isn't necessarily a right answer. This is where you can play with your brews and really create a cup that suits your preferences. Now, since we now understand TDS, let's talk about extraction yield. So extraction yield is also a percent. Essentially, extraction yield is just the percent of extracted material that is pulled out of a dose of coffee during the brew cycle. So let's come back to this example with 100 grams because it's a nice round number. Let's say I'm brewing a big pot of coffee and I'm using a 100 gram dose of coffee. I brew that coffee and afterwards I take those grounds and I let them dry for a couple days so there's no water left. And then I weigh those grounds. Now let's say at the end of it they weigh 80 grams. That means that I've extracted 20 grams of material, and that of course is 20% of my initial dose. That's an extraction yield of 20%. Now, here's the thing about extraction yield. Extraction yield doesn't have the same variability that we see in TDS. There's no real preference for the most part. With extraction yield, there's a right number and then there's a wrong number. Nobody prefers under-extracted coffee. Nobody prefers over-extracted coffee. This is a number that is important to maintain while we're brewing coffee. So the acceptable range of extraction yield for the most part is going to be somewhere around 18.5% to 19% on the low end and up to 24 to 25% on the top end. But that top end number kind of has a little bit of an asterisk by it, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. For in terms of what we're brewing at home, generally speaking, we're probably shooting for something around a 19 to 20% extraction yield. So, Why is this important to brewing at home? How can we use this knowledge to kind of make decisions about how we will actually want to brew? Well, what we can do is we can actually use our taste buds in a way that maybe you haven't thought before. So, for instance, let's say we're brewing a cup of coffee, right? So we have a new coffee that we got from the shop, we take it home, we grind it on our grinder at home, and we brew it up and we taste it, right? And for some reason, coffee tastes kind of sour, vegetal, tastes high in acid but doesn't have a lot of sweetness to it, maybe even a little bit of grainy characteristic to it. Well, those are all hallmarks of under-extracted notes. So the question is the coffee bad? No, maybe we're just under-extracting it. So what do we do at that point? Well, we need to extract more stuff from the coffee. So how do we do that? Well, easy, we grind finer, right? So if we grind finer, we're making more material available to be extracted. And so during the brew, more material will be extracted. So we grind a little bit finer and we brew another pot and we taste it and it's good. Taste, flavor is really, really great. But what if it's too strong now? So what if I just brewed a cup and I really like the flavor, but man, it's just too strong. I would really much prefer a lower TDS. Well, then we have to start playing with dose and grind. So if I want to have a lower TDS, what can I do? Well, I could add water, right? But at the same time, I could also just use a little less coffee. But if I use a little less coffee, then I might have an issue with actually over-extracting that coffee, because if you think about the ratio, I'm gonna have more water going over each individual grain of coffee. So if I want to decrease my TDS, yes, I need to decrease my dose. But I also probably want to coarsen my grind slightly. And it's probably not a big adjustment, just a small one. So let's back up and go to a second example. Let's say I brew up a cup at home and I'm getting some real bitterness out of this coffee. Some roast that really shouldn't be there, some astringency, some drying on the tongue, maybe some chemical kind of notes, some alkaloids like high caffeine, things like that. What's happening? Well, I'm really just over extracting the coffee. So how do I fix that? Well, easy, I need to make less material available to be extracted during the brew. So I'm going to coarsen my grind. I coarsen my grind slightly and I brew another cup and it's delicious. Now let's say I did that, but now my coffee is just not high enough TDS. I liked the strength of it before. Now, unfortunately, it's just a little bit weak. What can I do? Well, I don't want to just fine my grind up again because I saw what happened the last time. So what I really need to do is probably increase my dose. So if I increase my dose, that's going to increase my TDS because I'm really making more material available to the water that's coming through. However, I now have, based on the ratio, slightly less water coming through for every granule of coffee that I have. So I'm actually going to extract less from each granule, even though my TDS is going to go up. So if I like the flavor, but it's not strong enough, I really need to increase my dose, but I also want to slightly fine my grind. That's going to keep my extraction yield the same while increasing my TDS. All right, so here at the shop, when we're trying to play with these numbers, we use what's called a refractometer to go ahead and actually determine scientifically the TDS of the coffee that we're brewing. The problem is a good refractometer is going to set you back about $800. We understand that that's probably out of the budget for most people that are brewing at home. But the concepts that we're talking about here today, you can still apply in your home brewing just by simply trusting your taste buds. So, if we brew a batch and our TDS is giving us a low number and that calculates out to a low extraction yield, we're typically going to taste sourness. We're going to taste an acidity that lacks sweetness. We're going to taste sometimes vegetal notes. We're going to taste sometimes some grain notes. Those are types of, or even some salty notes too. Those are all classic hallmarks of under extraction. And at home, a lot of times if you brew coffee, these flavor notes are really evident, especially notes like vegetable notes, or especially notes like sour. Those are hallmarks of under extraction. So we can use those tasting notes to inform our decisions. We can tell ourselves this coffee has a low extraction yield. Now conversely, let's say we take our measurements and it tells us that our extraction yield is way too high. Well, we're going to be able to taste it. We taste that coffee, we're going to get some classic notes of over extraction. So we're going to get a lot of bitterness. We're going to get a lot of roast, even with coffees which aren't roasted very darkly. We're going to get some astringency, some dryness on the tongue. We also could get some really heavy chemical sort of notes or sort of flavors. These are all classic symptoms of over extraction. So even at home, if you don't have a refractometer, you can certainly taste these coffee, and if you get these notes, you know that your extraction yield is too high. All right, now that we've kind of gone over some examples at home, the last thing that I want to talk today about is grinder quality. What kind of a grinder do you really want to have at home? Why does a Whirly Blade grinder cost $10? Why do we have grinders that cost almost $4,000 at the shop? What does it get you? Why are they so expensive? But what it boils down to is the fact that, honestly, across the board, pretty much all coffee grinders suck. And yes, you heard me say that right. And it's not really the coffee grinders that suck, it's kind of coffee that sucks. The thing that we need to remember about coffee is that coffee is an organic, natural product. It's a seed. When we roast coffee, we are taking this green coffee product, we're drying it completely out of free moisture, we're increasing its size by double, and what we end up with is an extremely brittle substance, right? And we know that coffee is brittle. You could take a coffee bean, you can crush it in between your fingers and it pulverizes. So the problem with trying to take a brittle item and break it down into small uniform parts is that it's nearly impossible. Every time we crush or cut coffee, we actually end up fracturing it. And every time we fracture that coffee, we create these little tiny coffee particles that we call fines. So fines have some use in some sense of the word for espresso, but we're not going to focus on that today. For us, what we need to understand that fines end up producing a limiting factor in terms of how high we can push our extraction yield. So before we start talking about that, let's rehash extraction yield one more time. So remember, I said that the high-end level of extraction yield is 24 to 25%. So why should we aim for that? Why is a higher extraction yield better within this range? Well, it's a little bit complex, but needless to say, when we extract more material from an actual coffee bean, we're going to have more flavor compounds that end up reaching some level of detectability and actually become present in terms of what we can taste and smell in the cup. So, what do we gain? We gain complexity. We're going to get flavors at that 24 to 25% extraction yield level that we probably are not going to get at that 19 to 20% extraction yield. In addition, we're going to get more sweetness as well. So when people ask me, what do you get out of a high extraction yield? It's complexity and it's sweetness. So, how do fines limit our extraction? All right, I'm going to draw you guys a chart. A lot of you have probably seen something like this before. So anytime we grind coffee, we aren't creating a grind that is 100% uniform. We're always going to have kind of a variety of actual grind sizes within that sample. Now usually, it's going to look something like this. So we have our peak grind value. This is where our grinder is quote-unquote set for. Now, what happens is, as coffee fractures and we grinds it, we also have a small little bump down here. These are actually going to be our fines. So the important thing to realize is that because we have different particle sizes, each one of these particles is actually going to extract at a different extraction yield. So when we talk about having a 20% extraction, that just means that we've extracted 20% of the total material, or thinking about it differently, we've extracted an average amount of 20% of the extractable material from each individual kernel of coffee. But we don't actually do that in practice. So what happens is up here on our very large particle sizes, we might only be extracting 6% or 8% or 10%. And at our peak, we might be extracting around 20%. And as we get higher though, we might be extracting 24, 26, 28, 30, 40. Our fines might be extracting at a rate of 30 or 40%. And guess what? That's where we start to taste a lot of those bitter components that we were talking about before. So how does this set a limit for us? Well, the easiest way to think about it is what happens when we actually grind finer. So I'm going to draw you a second curve. Essentially what I've done here is I'm grinding finer. So my peak grind value has now shifted to a smaller particle size. And look what happens down here. This probably goes more like this, but that's right here we see that my fines have actually increased pretty substantially. Now why does that happen? Well, when we're going finer, what we're doing is we're actually cutting the coffee more times to break it down into smaller pieces. And remember, every time we cut, we're fracturing that coffee and creating fines. So the finer we grind, the more fines we create. So now, assuming that we're extracting somewhere around that 30 to 40% on these fines, eventually that extracted material is going to reach a level of detectability that's going to show up in the cup. So if we brewed with a bunch of different grind sizes and we kept going finer and finer and finer and finer, eventually we would start to get bitter notes in the cup. And at that point, we want to back off, and that would be the maximum extraction yield that a particular grinder could support. All right, so my board magically erased itself so that I can now move on to showing you guys some sample ground distribution graphs for a variety of grinder types. I'm hoping that once you see these graphs, you'll have a good understanding of why it's important to spend a little bit of money on a grinder. So, first off, let's do a whirly blade grinder. That is the grind distribution for a whirly blade grinder. If you notice it, you'll notice that it lacks a pretty distinctive peak in terms of particle size. You'll also notice that it has a very wide range of particles. Now, in a lot of ways, this makes sense. If you think about a burr grinder, it has two burrs that are turning against each other. Well, one's usually stationary. As that coffee comes through, it's forced through a gap that maintains some consistency. With a whirly blade grinder, we don't have that. We're literally pulverizing the coffee and simply breaking it up into a wide variety of large and small pieces. As you can probably imagine on this, what ends up happening is you have a huge variety of extraction yields from all of these particles. So no matter what you do in a whirly blade grinder, you are always going to have a cup that tastes both under-extracted and over-extracted, and it's never going to be tasty. So I would probably leave that one for the spices. Second option. What about an okay home grinder? Something in the $30 to $40, $50 range. Probably looking like something like this. So it still is having a more definite peak in terms of grind values, but you're getting a lot of fine creation, and that peak is not particularly narrow. Again, a lot of this has to do with the quality of the burrs. You're just not being able to create a truly uniform grind. In addition, those burrs typically aren't very sharp, and so you're going to create more fracturing and more fines. Let's move on. How about we talk about something like a Baratza, something in that $150 to $200 range. Well, depending on something like that, you probably get something like this. I'm going to draw two So I'm going to draw two curves here, and I just want to demonstrate a purpose. So if you're grinding coarse enough to do auto drip or even manual brew, your curve's probably going to look something like this. It's probably going to be pretty decent. However, if you try to use something like that for espresso, or for a very high extraction yield for a manual brew, you're going to end up having a pretty significant fine peak. Typically speaking, under my personal experience, a good Baratza grinder is still going to limit you to maybe 19 to 20% extraction, which is awesome. It tastes super great. It's awesome for home, and I think for the value, those grinders are incredible. It's what I use at home because I can't really afford the next step up. So let's kind of go to the other end of the spectrum. So the other end of the spectrum might be something like an EK43, or in the espresso realm might be the compact PK series. With a grind like that, when we're talking about drip settings, we're probably looking at something like this. You can see that it has an exceptionally sharp peak in terms of grounds distribution, and at least at drip settings, you have a very little to no fines. I shouldn't say there's going to be fines there, but not anywhere close to being able to be detected in the cup. Now, even if we take a grinder like that and move to espresso, we're going to have something like this. We're going to have a very small peak of fines, and we're going to have still a really nice sharp peak for our average grind size. This is what a good grinder buys you. So when you go from home to a commercial, there's a few things like larger motors, more durable motors, grinder casings. It's obviously larger. You're paying more for those for a commercial grinder. But realistically, when you go from a low-end commercial grinder to a high-end commercial grinder, you're really paying for two things. So the first thing you're paying for is a burr set, right? So it's the materials, it's the workmanship, it's how that burr set is cut, it's how precisely that burr set is cut, it's the design of that burr set. These types of things are going to make a huge difference. The second thing that you're paying for is really the quality of the workmanship, because you're paying for alignment. You can have the best burr set in the world, but if it isn't aligned properly, it's not going to work as well as it could. So burr set, alignment, that's what you're paying for when you're throwing down a lot of money for a grinder. So what do those two things get you? Get you a higher extraction yield. That's what you're paying for. So guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed my time here with you. If you guys have any other questions about this, please leave them in the comments. Happy to answer them, and we'll get to them as quick as we can. Hope you guys all have a wonderful day, and we'll be back soon with another installment. Don't forget to subscribe and like us if you want.